Okay, well, we're going to introduce Dr. Ross here in just a second. I'm going to have a good buddy of his, Ted Asnarian, introduce him. So, Ted, are you ready to do that?
I can, yeah.
Right on. So this is Ted, and Ted's going to introduce Dr. Ross.
All right. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Dr. Hugh Ross is founder and senior scholar at Reasons to Believe, RTB, an organization that exists to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science.
Yeah.
While in college, Hugh committed his life to Jesus Christ after his cosmology studies convinced him of the existence of a creator, specifically the God of the Bible. Dr. Ross holds a degree in physics from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. After 5 years on the Caltech faculty, he transitioned to full-time ministry and still serves on the pastoral team at Christ Church in Sierra Madre. His writings include peer-reviewed journal and magazine articles, hundreds of blogs, and numerous books, including Noah's Flood Revisited, Rescuing Inerrancy, and The Creator and the Cosmos, among others. He has spoken on hundreds of university campuses, as well as at conferences and churches around the world, and participates in the weekly Stars, Cells, and God podcast. And on a personal note, I'd just like to say, I've enjoyed attending his Sunday school class at Christ Church Sierra Madre since 2007 or so. It's really good. It's helped me in apologetics and defending the gospel, working among scientists and engineers. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce him to you. Welcome, Dr. Ross.
Thank you. Well, thank you. And no, I'm not an American. I am now. I'm a citizen, but I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. And I'm the founder of Reasons to Believe. And if you want to ask me questions, I have a Facebook and an X page, and I literally get hundreds of questions per day. Feel free to ask me questions there. I will hang around afterwards for any questions any of you might have. But if you're like me, you think of the best question to ask 3 hours after the event is over. So that's why I have that social media presence. Now, I was born in Montreal, Canada, and that's where my father had a really successful hydraulics engineering business. But his financial partner saw the growth of the company and wound up taking all the funds for the company and escaped to Brazil. And my dad in one day had to lay off 40 engineers and to close everything down. He was a self-educated engineer, so he couldn't get a job as an engineer. So he moved our family out to Vancouver. And so I was raised in an immigrant neighborhood filled with refugees, literally from all over the world, and a poor neighborhood in Vancouver. Now, the thing about Canada is the Christians tend to live in suburbs outside the city cores. So as I was being raised in Vancouver, I did not know any Christians. In fact, I didn't really get to meet a serious Bible-believing Christian until I showed up at Caltech at age 27 to do research on quasars and galaxies. However, growing up, I did meet some stars and galaxies. You know anything about Vancouver? It's a place where it basically rains almost nonstop. In fact, we would tell people it's really easy to predict the weather in Vancouver. If you can see the mountains, it's going to rain. If you can't see the mountains, it's raining already. But I remember one night when the clouds broke and you could see stars. And I asked my parents, are those stars hot? And they said, yes, son, they're hot. Can you tell me why they're hot? And they said, no, you need to go to the library. So at age 7, I went to the Vancouver Public Library. It had 3 million volumes. And right away became fascinated with books on physics and astronomy. In fact, from the age of 7 onwards, I would bring home 4 or 5 books on physics and astronomy. And just became thoroughly fascinated by that study. And at age 8, I knew that my future career would be in astrophysics. And so every year I would study a different subdiscipline of astronomy. I mean, one year I studied the interior physics of stars, another year the dynamics of galaxies. But it was at age 16 that I devoted a year to studying cosmology. Now, cosmology, that's the study of the origin and structure of the universe. And that was a time when there was a major debate going on. Is the universe is a steady state? Is it a big bang? Is it an oscillating universe? Is it a hesitating universe? But in reading the books and articles, I recognized that of all these different explanations, the Big Bang explanation was fitting all the observations. And recognize if it's Big Bang, that means the universe has a beginning. I said, well, if there's a beginning, there has to be a beginner. Who or what is that beginner? And I really didn't know where to start looking, but I said, hey, Immanuel Kant is noted as being the father of modern cosmology. I'll read his Critique of Pure Reason. So I read that book and realized he didn't have the right concepts of space and time. And he also, anyway, I wound up going from Kant to reading René Descartes and discovered that he too didn't have the right picture of the universe. And because I was going to a high school in Vancouver that literally had refugees from around the world, I think I was the only Anglo-Saxon in my entire class. And a number of them heard about what I was doing, and I got approached by some Hindus in our class, and they said, you need to read the Vedas. So I started reading the Hindu Vedas, and it says, oh, this is where the oscillating universe model comes from. Because in Hinduism, they teach that the universe has a beginning, and then winds up ending and collapsing. And so the universe goes through these cycles of beginning and ending, that kind of like a phoenix. But I read that they said every 4.32 billion years, the universe restarts. I said, well, I know that number is not correct. And also I knew that the entropy measure of the universe was 100 million times too high to get any restart of the universe to occur. So I said, I guess it's not Hinduism. And there were some Buddhists in our class who encouraged me to read the Buddhist commentaries, and I discovered their cosmology is basically the same as what you see in Hinduism. And then I read the Quran, and I realized, okay, the Quran has these different accounts of how the universe begins, how the earth begins in the history of life, but the three different accounts contradict one another. So I said, I guess this isn't it either. I wound up going into Zoroastrianism, looked at Mormonism and several other religions. But finally, I did decide I'm going to check out Christianity. Now, when I tell people I didn't really get to meet a serious Christian until I showed up at Caltech, I actually did get to see two Christians from 30 feet away when I was 11 years of age. And these were two businessmen that came into our public school, put a couple of boxes on our teacher's desk, and left. They never said a single word. But in those boxes were Gideon Bibles. And we're all told if we wanted one, we could have one for free. Well, being in a poor neighborhood, a free book, you don't turn that down. So every one of us took home a Gideon Bible. And I got that at age 11 and did not pick it up until I was 17. It just stayed on my shelf. But having gone through all these other religions, and having gone through the philosophical writings, I decided I need to check out that Gideon Bible. But by the way, this is the Gideon Bible was given to me at age 11. The cover is gone because our dog chewed the cover off. And that caused one of my sons to say, our dog must be from the pit of hell. He's destroying the Word of God. But my other son was more sanguine and said, oh, no, our dog is feeding on the Word of God. But hey, the rest of it is virtually intact. And as I was going through this Gideon Bible, the thing that struck me was how frequently it said you have to test everything. fact, what it says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, everything is to be tested, but we're to hold fast to that which proves to be good and true. Now, what I found in these other holy books of the different religions of the world was they were appealing to subjective evidence. If it feels good, you know it's true. And as a young budding scientist, I said, that doesn't feel for me. But when I started going through the Bible, I realized this book stands alone in commanding objective testing. In fact, what really struck me is when I began to go through the early chapters of the Bible, is seeing how perfectly it followed the scientific method. Now, the education I had in Canada, we were taught the scientific method in grade 1. We got it again in grade 2. We got it all 12 years. So I was saturated in the scientific method when I picked up this Gideon Bible. But as I was going through Genesis chapter 1, I says, oh, this starts off by telling you the frame of reference. Then it gives you the initial conditions. Then it tells you the sequence of events. And then it tells you about the final conditions. And then there's an exhortation to put this to the test. So I said, this is just like the scientific method. Well, it took me another 9 years to figure out why the creation texts in the Bible so perfectly follow the scientific method. I wound up reading a 28-volume set put out by the Scottish Academic Press, where they document the scientific method has its origin in the creation texts of the Bible and in Reformation theology. So yeah, of course the Bible follows the scientific method. That's where it comes from. So sometimes I refer to it as the biblical testing method. As you look at Genesis chapter 1, it begins with a statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And right away I said, what are these heavens and earth? And so as I began to go through the Old Testament, I kept looking for the word universe. You do see it in the New Testament. The Greeks have a word for the universe. But biblical Hebrew, there is no word for the universe. But 13 times you'll see this phrase, the heavens and the earth. It's an idiom that means the whole of matter, energy, space, and time. So it's kind of the Hebrew way of describing the universe. But right at the very beginning, it tells us there is a beginning to the universe. Now, I was reading this for the first time at age 17, but that was the same time when I was aware that there were physicists in South Africa and in Britain that were beginning to work on what we now call the space-time theorems. And today we've got over 30 of those theorems. But what these theorems basically tell us is that if the universe contains mass, and each one of you is living proof that it does contain mass, and if the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of stars and galaxies in the universe, then there must be a beginning to space and time. So this is kind of the space-time theorems in a nutshell. That the universe has mass and general relativity correctly describes cosmic dynamics, then space and time must be created. But that implies there must be some kind of causal agent beyond space and time who creates our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. Now, having read the Hindu Vedas, having read Zoroastrianism, and all these other different religions, I realized what they claim is that God creates within space and time, where space and time eternally exists. Where the Bible stands apart is saying that space and time are not eternal. That God created space and time when He created the universe. So that really encouraged me that maybe this book is different from all the other books that I had been reading. In fact, Alexander Blinken, the author of the most famous of these space-time theorems, he's an agnostic Russian physicist who now lives in America. But he wrote this. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of an eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, if you go on YouTube, you'll see a number of debates where I debate atheist astronomers and atheist physicists. What I find interesting, they all call themselves atheists, but we actually pin them down and say, what do you think about the universe? And what do you think about what's behind the universe? And what I discover is they're really not atheists, they're deists. They believe that there's something beyond the universe that's responsible for bringing the universe into existence. So some kind of miracle working entity must exist. Now, that's Genesis 1:1. I discovered no matter where I go in the world, everybody seems to know that passage. They may know nothing else about the Bible, but they do seem to know that one. Now, as you go through the rest of Genesis 1, it takes you through 6 periods of creation, the 6 days of creation. And what I noticed was that, first of all, it gives you a change of a point of view. For Genesis 1:1, a point of view is the universe. But in Genesis 1:2, it changes the point of view to the surface of the earth. It says the Spirit of God is hovering or brooding over the surface of the waters, which tells me we're to interpret these 6 creation days from the point of view of an observer on the surface of the earth, below the clouds, not above the clouds. Now that's step 1 of the scientific method. Don't interpret until you first establish the frame of reference. It was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. But step 2 is don't interpret until you note the starting conditions or the initial conditions. And those initial conditions are, it's dark on the surface of the waters, so it's dark everywhere in the surface of the waters. The water covers the whole surface of the earth. The earth is empty of life and unfit for life. Now, Job 37, 38, and 39 actually give you way more scientific details on creation than you get anywhere in the book of Genesis. When you look at Job 38, it says, God speaking, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. So it's basically telling us the reason why it's dark everywhere in the surface of the waters is because there's this atmosphere that doesn't let any light from the sun come through. Now this is something I understood quite well even at age 15. Namely that the more distant a planet is from its star, the less heat it gets from its star, and therefore the more gases it's going to accumulate in its atmosphere. And the more mass of the planet, the stronger its gravity, and again the more gas it will accumulate. And so this is in textbooks that Earth must have started off with an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. I mean, for example, you can look at Mercury and Venus and Mars. Just look at the distance the planet is from its star, how massive the planet is. You can determine what atmosphere it should have. And for example, Venus has an atmosphere 90 times thicker than the Earth. So it still has the atmosphere it started with. It also works for Mars. It's so close to the sun that the heat of the sun has blasted away nearly all of its atmosphere. Mars is farther away, but it's not a very big planet, and so it doesn't have a very thick atmosphere either. But this is what the primordial Earth looked like. A very thick atmosphere, also a very deep ocean. Earth started off with an ocean that was about 1,000 kilometers deep. And so, yeah, there would have been water over the whole surface of the Earth. And so we're to interpret these 6 days of creation from the point of view of an observer below the clouds, not above the clouds. Now, I run into scientists all the time to say Genesis 1 teaches nothing but scientific nonsense. I said, well, if you have the point of view above the clouds, I agree with you. Everything it says then would be incorrect scientifically. But if you put the point of view on the surface of the waters, what you're going to discover, everything is correctly stated in the correct chronological order. I'll take you through that quickly, but first, what about this word day? Because there's a major controversy going on. In fact, I didn't even know there was a controversy until I came to the United States. You know, I looked at Genesis chapter 1, and said these days clearly are consecutive long periods of time. But when I came here to America, I discovered there were a lot of people in churches that thought these days were 24-hour periods. But the truth is, the Hebrew word that's translated as day yom has 4 distinct literal definitions. And just like I told you earlier, there's no Hebrew word for the universe. Well, Biblical Hebrew has a vocabulary size of 3,000 words, if you don't count the names of people and cities. English has 4 million. So we shouldn't be surprised that these Hebrew nouns have multiple literal definitions. The word for earth, for example, has 5 distinct literal definitions. But these are the different definitions for the Hebrew word that's translated day. Part of the daylight hours, all the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. Now, I didn't know this when I picked up the Bible at age 17. I didn't know Hebrew, but when I looked at the text, I said, there has to be multiple definitions because 3 are used on the first page. When you get to creation day 1, it uses the word day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's contrasting seasons, days, and years. That's day is 24 hours. But Genesis 2:4 uses the same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. So that's day is a long period of time. The other thing I noted was that you got an evening was, morning was phrase after each of the first 6 creation days. And I didn't know what the words evening and morning meant in Hebrew. I do today. But I knew at a minimum it's telling me each of these days has a start time and an end time. But when you get to day 7, there's no evening was, morning was phrase. It's just not there. And so I said, that means we're still in God's 7th day. As I read on in the Bible, Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 both state that we're still in God's 7th day. So that told me these days are long periods of time. I never thought that there was any issue about the time scale until I came to the United States and met people who interpreted it away. But to me, it answered an enigma that had bothered me ever since I was 10 and a half years of age. What happened when I was 10 and a half, my parents thought I was being obsessive in my studies of physics and astronomy. I didn't think so, but they did. So they wound up buying our family a big, thick book on evolutionary biology. So we got to get Hugh reading something besides physics and astronomy. And I was impressed because I knew they didn't have money, but they sacrificed to buy this really thick book. So I read the book, found out I was only in the family that read it. But I went to my parents and said, the numbers don't work. We see all this evidence for new phyla, new orders, new classes, new families of life showing up before humanity, but none of that happens after humanity. What gives? They said, go ask your science teachers. I asked my science teachers, and I say, you better talk to those professors of science you know at the university. And they just shrugged their shoulders. But the first time I picked up this book, I said, this answers the fossil record enigma. For 6 days God creates, on the 7th day he stops creating. For 6 days God creates, on the 7th day he redeems. And I remember reading in the Bible how God begins his works of redeeming human beings before he creates anything at all. So I said, okay, this makes sense. He creates for 6 days, on the 7th day he redeems. But it answered for me the question, why is it that so many astronomers and geophysicists believe in God, but so few field biologists believe in God? Well, if you're an astronomer, all your data comes from the past. It takes time for light to travel from your sources to your telescope. In fact, I frequently share with my wife, I can't be held accountable for the present because all my data comes from the past. And most of our data comes from deep time. So we see the evidence of miraculous interventions everywhere in the past record of astrophysics. But if you're a field biologist, you'll say, I see no evidence for God. They're working on the wrong day. If you're drawing data from the human era, you'll see no evidence for God's miraculous interventions. Well, as you go into Genesis 1:3, it says, "Let there be light." This is the first time that visible light shows up on the surface of the earth. And what has happened since the 1960s, we now understand how it is Earth lost its deep ocean and its thick atmosphere. Namely that our solar system began with 5 rocky planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, but a 5th one called Theia. And Theia was a planet a little bit bigger than Mars, and was orbiting very close to the Earth. And what happened was there was an event where Theia collided into the Earth. And that collision stripped away virtually all of Earth's water and all of Earth's atmosphere. It also led to the formation of a huge moon orbiting our small planet. Turns out that's crucial for life to exist on planet Earth. But you wind up with a very thin atmosphere, that very thin layer of water, where the atmosphere is so thin that visible light from the sun now can reach the Earth and photosynthesis can begin. Then we get into the second creation day, and all it says is, "Let there be water above and water below." And so what does all that mean? Well, I discovered why there's such a brief statement. The book of Job is actually older than the book of Genesis. And the book of Job, there's a whole chapter and a half on the events of creation day 2. It's in Job 37 and the first half of Job 38, and basically describes how God set up this complex water cycle where multiple forms of liquid precipitation fall on the earth and multiple forms of frozen precipitation fall on the earth. And it's a combination of these 6 forms of precipitation that allows agriculture to take place all over the planet, all 12 months of the year. I mean, here in Southern California, if all it did was rain, we'd be in big trouble. In order to sustain our agriculture, we need a huge quantity of snow falling on the Sierra Nevada mountains. It melts slowly, which means we got water 12 months of the year. But this is described in detail in the book of Job. Then we go into the third creation day. It says, "Let dry ground appear." And this is when God transforms our planet from a water world where you got oceans and continents coexisting. Now, I'm old enough to remember when the geology textbooks were telling us the continents have always been here. But I remember reading those textbooks in my teenage years and saying, it's an assertion, but there's no evidence for it. It's just an assumption. So this was a story back in the 1950s that the continents had always been here. I show up at the University of British Columbia, and I heard that 2 of the 3 physicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics were going to teach a course. It was the first course ever taught anywhere in the world on plate tectonics. So I said, I'm going to sign up for that course. Well, they found out I was an undergraduate. And so they said, hey, it's just graduate students. But they also found out that I had won the science fair for British Columbia, and I've been reading astronomy and physics textbooks since I was 7. So as a sophomore physics student, they let me take the class. And this is what the 2 professors said, that with plate tectonics, you get a growth in the continents that looks like this, where because of plate tectonics, more and more, excuse me, let me pull it back here. This was a story that the continents start off covering just a small part of the surface of the earth and wind up covering 29% today. I remember going up to one of those 2 professors and saying, is it possible that it starts at 0? And they said, yeah, anywhere from 0 to 10% fits the data that we have. So I said, well, maybe the Bible actually has it right. Flash forward to 2000, and this is a story that indeed it does start off with only water on the surface, and then there's a period of time where you get a sudden growth. This is the very latest picture. We now realize that the growth of continents is intimately linked with the deep oxygen cycle. And there was an event about 2.4 billion years ago where we see the Earth transform from being covered with nothing but water to where the continents suddenly jump up and cover 27% of the surface of the Earth and very gradually grow from that point forward. That was discovered in 2018, and I just shared this with you to make the point. Even during my teenage years, it was clear that the Bible likely got it right. And what's happened the years since, it's not just likely, we now know that it really did happen, and we actually see in 2018, the more we learn about the past geological history of the Earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis taught thousands of years ago. If you want to read about it, as you heard, I've written hundreds of blogs, and one of those blogs talks about, one of those blogs written in June 11th, 2018, talks about how all this happened. Simply go to reasons.org and look up today's new reason to believe, you'll find it. But we also notice on Creation Day 3, this is when vegetation proliferates on the continents. And I've done a lot of debates. In fact, you probably know the Skeptic Society is headquartered just a few miles from here. And I've debated 4 times on university campuses, the executive director, Michael Shermer. And we've never had a debate on Genesis or the Bible, but it doesn't matter. Whatever debate we have, he thinks Genesis 1 is the Achilles heel. And he says, wait a minute, Hugh. The fossil record tells us we get animals in the ocean before we get vegetation on the continental land masses. This is clear evidence that your Bible got it wrong. I said, well, wait a minute, Michael. Animals have shells and skeletons. Therefore, their remains get preserved for a long period of time. Vegetation decays rapidly and the evidence disappears. But what happened in 2009, scientists found the isotope evidence that vegetation proliferated on the continental land masses for 200 million years before animals show up in the oceans. Then in 2011, they actually found fossils. Not complete fossils. The biggest fossil they found of vegetation was 1 millimeter in diameter. So just fossil parts. But it showed that vegetation was abundant on the continents 600 million years before animals show up in the ocean. Again, it's evidence. The more we learn about science, the tighter fit we get what the Bible taught thousands of years ago. And then we have on day 4, the atmosphere going from haze, where you get light, but you can't see the objects responsible for the light, or it becomes transparent. And what was responsible for the clearing of the atmosphere is the second great oxygenation event. In fact, there was a team of physicists that did an experiment. They had this big flask. They filled it with the known atmospheric components of the early Earth's atmosphere. Then they gradually put more and more oxygen into the flask. And what they noted is the more oxygen they put in the flask, the less hazy the air in the flask became. So it went from something like this, where you can't see anything through the flask at all, where you look through the flask and you can see, hey, there seems to be something in the background. Oh, look, there's a mountain there through all the haze. And then the haze begins to clear, and eventually it clears enough that you can see the moon. And so that's what happened. Once the oxygen hit 8% in the atmosphere, that's when the atmosphere goes from a thick haze to becoming transparent. But with 8% oxygen, you now have enough oxygen for the crater to make animals. And the moment it hits 8%, you get animals. And that's Creation Day 5, where it tells us that there was a sudden explosion of small sea creatures in the ocean. 8% oxygen makes that happen. In fact, we now know the date, 575 million years ago. Then the oxygen jumped up to 10%. And with 10%, you can have animals like us, with backbones, a circulatory system, internal and external organs. In fact, what's interesting, every basic body plan that ever occurred on planet Earth showed up simultaneously 538 million years ago. Even the phylum that we belong to, the chordates, showed up 538 million years ago, including vertebrates. They were there right at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And this is what Kevin Peterson, one of the world's foremost experts on the Cambrian explosion, wrote. He said, elucidating the materialistic basis for the Cambrian explosion has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. Then we move into the latter part of creation, day 5. This is only the second time you see the word create. You see it first in Genesis 1:1, when God creates the physical universe. On creation day 5, you see the word being used again for when God creates the first soulish animals. These are animals that are not only physical, they're also soulish, and that they're endowed with mind, will, and emotions. These are the animals that will emotionally bond to us human beings. They're the animals that we can tame and train to do service for us, or to have relationships with us. And describes God creating birds and then creating the sea mammals. And these are the creatures that are capable of bonding with human beings. What we notice is they're designed to serve and please a higher species, namely us human beings. Then we get into creation day 6, and it skips over God creating the first land mammals and jumps ahead to God creating the 3 specialized kinds of land mammals that are crucial for launching civilization. So it begins with the short-legged land mammals. These are the rodents. Oops. Here we go. Rodents. You might say, what do we need rodents for? Aren't we trying to get rid of the rats and mice? Well, we notice about human beings. We're tall, we're slender, we have very little hair in our bodies, which means we're well adapted for warm climates, but we're poorly adapted for cold climates. Neanderthals, for example, had much shorter limbs than we do, a barrel-shaped body. They were well designed for a cold climate. But we notice is the moment humans come upon the scene, we quickly displace the Neanderthals and we live in climate zones that are 15 degrees colder than what they can possibly tolerate. The difference is we wore clothes. They did not. At best they may have had animal capes on them, but no clothing. Humans immediately were wearing clothes. What enabled us to wear those clothes? These short-legged land mammals that grow thick fur. And we notice about these rodents, they don't mind hanging around human beings. And they don't mind being around thousands of their buddies. And they're easy to feed. Humans quickly noted this, how easy they are to tame and to feed, and basically harvested their furs to make sophisticated clothing, which enabled us to live all over the world. Then the other 2 kinds that are mentioned are the long-legged animals that are easy to tame and the long-legged animals that are difficult to tame. The long-legged land mammals that are easy to tame are the farm animals, sheep, goats, horses, and cows. The ones that are difficult to tame are the carnivores, lions, dogs, different kinds of cats. And by the way, I got a lion here, and when I was at Caltech, there was a student there who wound up becoming one of the top people at JPL. He brought his pet lion to class every day. And that lion loved people. But the first thing the lion would do, and come into a Caltech lecture hall, charge the professor. Not to do him any harm, just wanted to sit beside the professor because knew that's where all the students would be looking. So really enjoyed that fellowship and loved to have toddlers romp with him at lunchtime. So God designed them to fellowship with us. He designed the herbivores to serve and please us. And last of all, we have God creating human beings. It's the 3rd time we see the word create. We're different from all other life. We're not just physical, we're not just soulish, we are spiritual. As God designed the birds and mammals to relate to us, a higher species, He designed us human beings to relate to a higher being, namely God himself. But what I did after, by the way, it took me about 4 hours to get through Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because I was going to all my science textbooks and checking out to see whether or not they got all the details correct. Also went through the stuff in the book of Job to see if it got all that correct. But here's my conclusion. Once we realize that the word day for the creation days is a long period of time, and that the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, notice the Bible gets a perfect score on describing the initial conditions, also gets a perfect score on describing the events of creation and putting them in the correct chronological order. That was my first 4 hours in looking at the Bible. That also motivated me to say this book is worth a deeper study. So I made a commitment I was going to spend an hour or two a day reading the Bible. Actually, it was between midnight and 2 in the morning, because I knew my parents wouldn't approve. So I was doing it all secretly. But gone through the Bible verse by verse all the way to Revelation 22. And having done that, I realized Genesis 1 wasn't unique. The Bible made over 200 accurate predictions of future scientific discoveries. There are more than that, but those are the 200 I found. And I actually went through a calculation. What's the probability that the Bible could correctly describe and predict these future scientific discoveries without the creator of the universe actually telling the human authors what was going on? And determined that probability was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 300th power. So that's 0.000299 zeros. And came up with that calculation the same time that my physics professor gave us an assignment to calculate the probability that a student in our class of 600 would be killed by a reversal of the second law of thermodynamics before he had to hand in our solution to the problem within the next week. It turns out that probability is quite tiny. By the way, it's not that difficult to calculate. In a room like this, for example, there are quadrillions of air molecules, and they're all at different temperatures. But because of thermodynamics, we all feel roughly the same temperature. There's actually a statistical probability that the trillions of molecules in this room that are below the freezing point of water will wander in the vicinity of where that guy is sitting and freeze him to death. That could actually happen. There's 1 chance in 10 to the 80 that you're going to be a frozen stiff by the time we're done today. But our professor basically gave us an assignment to make a point. In physics, we can never prove anything absolutely. But if we can show that something is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 50th of happening, then we know it's never happened anytime, anywhere in the universe. Well, I had just demonstrated that this book is 220 times, 10 to the 220 times more reliable than the second law of thermodynamics. I said, I trust that second law every second of my life. It'd be irrational not to put even more trust in the message of this book. And I want to give the Gideons a credit. At least in the Gideon Bible they gave me, they included 2 pages at the end that told you what you need to do if you become convinced that the Bible indeed is from the God that created the universe and it's all true and accurate. And basically made the point. If this is true, then you know that the creator of the universe came to planet Earth, lived a life amongst us in human form, but demonstrated that he was morally perfect, and basically showed all of us that we fall short of that moral perfection. And I remember reading in the New Testament, there was a time when Jesus gave a long talk where he told the audience, I am without sin, and his mother was nodding her head. And his brothers were nodding their head, and his sisters. It's like, hey, if his mother says he's without sin, he must really be without sin. You're not going to fool your mother. But also realize, Gideon's explained, that Jesus in his moral perfection chose to die on the cross so he could trade his moral perfection for our moral imperfection. And they basically explain how none of us can overcome the sin within us. But God is prepared to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. So I wound up signing my name at 1:07 in the morning in the back of this Gideon Bible, committing my life to Jesus Christ. And basically making a commitment. God, I want you to take control over my life. Let your Holy Spirit come within me and help me step by step overcome the sin in my life. Now, the Gideons did that in 2 pages. I just want to give you a brief opportunity right now, because I remember sharing some of this with a stranger on the street outside of Caltech. Some guy just bumped into me, asked me who I was, started asking me questions, found out I was a Christian, asked me questions about the Bible, then eventually said, "Stop, I don't want to hear anymore." I said, "Look, I'm not trying to offend you. Just have a good day." He said, "No, I don't want you to go away. I've heard enough evidence. You need to tell me what I need to do with my life." So what I want to do right now is just make a brief prayer, and if you can pray along with me. If you've heard enough evidence from what I shared tonight, great. I'll give a prayer for you. If you need more evidence, that's what we're here for, at Reasons to Believe. So yes, just let me pray. Father in heaven, we want to thank you that you're a God that's revealed yourself through a Bible, but you've also revealed yourself through the book of nature. You've given us 2 trustworthy books. And right now, I just recognize that indeed you have truthfully revealed yourself to me. And you've shown that, hey, there's a law written in my heart, a moral law, and that you placed within me the conviction I fall short of living up to that moral law. But thank you that you chose to sacrifice yourself to pay for my sin that I can't pay for myself. That you're prepared to do for me what I can't do for myself. And so right now, Jesus, I ask you to send your Holy Spirit into my life. I repent of the sin that I've committed and ask you to begin to transform me. I'm going to make you the boss over my life. Take direction from you, because you know better than I do what's best for my life. So come into my life and begin to transform me. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right. I'll turn it over to you, sir. And after he's done, if you've got questions, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.